The 9/11 Memorial will honor my partner and the officers who responded that morning.
It's for my brother.
And my 343 brothers who didn't make it.
It's about hope for the future.
So we always remember September 11th.
For my husband who never came home.
And the first responders who saved my life.
This shows the world that we can rebuild.
That we are united.
And that we are strong.
Because the best of humanity can overcome the worst hate.
It's for all the heroes like my dad.
This year, the National September 11th Memorial opens in New York City. Join us to honor, remember, and reunite. You can help right now by texting the word HOPE to 80088 to give $10.
For many of the nearly 50,000 9/11 first responders, the wounds of the Twin Tower attacks are far from healing. These rescue workers continue to struggle with respiratory illness, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder, and many of them may be at increased risk for developing a number of cancers. Because they and their fellow rescue workers were picking through rubble littered with asbestos, mercury, crushed fluorescent light bulbs, and other known toxins, and they were outfitted with only their normal uniform to protect them from potential contaminants. When hundreds of victims and their families were left struggling with impending health problems and emotional instabilities after the World Trade Center attacks, the Uniformed Firefighters Association of Greater New York selected one law firm, Sullivan, Papain, Block, McGrath, and Canavo, their friends and trusted legal advisors for the past 20 years, to come to their rescue. Because sometimes even first responders need to be saved. As Stephen Cassidy, the president of the Uniformed Firefighters Association, wrote in his letter of thanks to Sullivan Papain, working with the UFA and government officials in Washington, D.C., the firm was instrumental in the creation of the September 11th Victim Compensation Fund, which was established by Congress. Additionally, he writes that Sullivan Papain went well beyond assisting in the creation of the VCF fund, as they then willingly and successfully undertook, for absolutely no fee, the representation of 362 injured firefighters and families of deceased firefighters who applied to the fund. As a result of their tireless efforts and dedication, Sullivan Papain has recovered over $260 million from the fund for injured firefighters and families of fallen firefighters, all while foregoing millions of dollars in legal fees. And in 2004, the firm earned the National Law Journal's 2004 Pro Bono Award. Truly, the magnitude of Sullivan Papain's unheralded work for New York City's bravest and their families affected by the September 11th tragedy deserves to be recognized. In 2004, following the VCF's closure, Sullivan Papain filed the first lawsuits against New York City for failing to provide respirators to rescue and recovery workers. The resulting World Trade Center disaster site litigation lasted for 8 years, with over 10,000 responders bringing suit. Today, for the first time ever, the Insider Exclusive goes behind the headlines with Nick Papain, partner at Sullivan, Papain, Block, McGrath, and Canavo, in New York's finest first responders, Barbara Burnette's story, to reveal how their firm fought for 8 long, difficult, and challenging years to successfully reach a $600 million plus settlement in 2010 on behalf of Barbara and hundreds more of New York's finest. Additionally, as a result of their continued efforts, on January 2nd, 2011, President Obama signed the James Zadroga 9/11 Health and Compensation Act of 2010 into law. The Zadroga Act reopens the September 11th Victims Compensation Fund of 2001. The new VCF is funded with over $2.7 billion and will operate until 2016. The The VCF will compensate those who suffered certain physical injuries as a result of the World Trade Center disaster, including exposures to dust, smoke, and debris. And one of those brave first responders who testified before Congress in 2009 for the passage of the Zadroga Act, former NYPD Detective Barbara Burnette, whose highly decorated and dynamic career ended because of injuries sustained from service at the World Trade Center site, will be joining us today on this Insider exclusive special. Nick Papain has earned the highest respect from citizens and lawyers alike as one of the best people's trial lawyers in New York and in the nation, and served as president of the 4,000-member New York State Trial Lawyers Association for the 2008-2009 term. Nick and his firm played a major role in the representation of the state of New York in its action against the major tobacco companies, which resulted in a record $25 billion recovery for the state, which many leading authorities have recognized as the most successful legal attack on a major public health hazard in the history of recorded civilization. Nick's amazing courtroom skills and headline-grabbing success rate continue to provide his clients with the results they need and the results they deserve.
Hi, I'm Steve Murphy, and this is the Insider Exclusive, live from New York City.
It is my great pleasure to introduce Nick Papain to the show. Welcome to the show, Nick.
Thank you, Steve.
Your firm has represented some very serious injuries of people following the 9/11 disaster right here in New York City. Litigation that's been ongoing for, what, almost 11 years.
In one form or another, that's correct, Steve.
Yeah. Today we're going to talk a little bit about I want you to give an overview of the World Trade Center lawsuits, the litigation that has taken place over the last 8 years following, and give our audience a little bit of a history, what happened immediately after 9/11 for some of the first responders who came down with illnesses as a result of working at Ground Zero.
Well, you know, it started on September 11 when in this office we saw outside our window the terrorist attack. We saw those two planes go into the World Trade Center buildings.
Yeah.
And that resulted, as you know, in the loss of close to 3,000 lives, including 343 firefighters who, as people were trying to get out of harm's way, were going into harm's way.
Right.
People were going down those steps, they were going up those steps.
And your firm has represented the New York firefighters for the last 20, 30 years?
For some 3 decades, Steve.
Right.
We've been fortunate enough to be general counsel to the Uniform Firefighters Association.
Now, originally there was a victims' compensation fund set up,
yes,
but it ended by, what was it, December 22nd, 2003?
That's correct.
So in other words, you had to be diagnosed with some illness by that time in order to receive some sort of compensation.
That's right, and that was the unfortunate part of the fund. As welcomed as the fund was for those who either lost their lives, their family members, and those that were diagnosed early, but for thousands of other 9/11 responders, rescue workers who were down on the site day after day on that pile, on that toxic pile.
Yeah.
Their illnesses did not get diagnosed until long after the fund closed in December.
And they were breathing in asbestos, chemicals, all kinds of toxins.
They were inhaling, unbeknownst to them, very toxic contaminants.
Yeah, my understanding was the city had at one time a plan to buy some sort of respiratory devices in case there was a collapse of a building, but never really implemented it, did it?
Well, no, it didn't. And that in itself was a great travesty. Mm-hmm. In 1997, a safety division, the OSHA division of the fire department of the city of New York, had come up with a plan that called for firefighters to be protected for all foreseeable tragedies, such as collapse of buildings, which is what we had here. Because they knew from collapses of buildings, you would be exposing those responding
right.
to various toxic chemicals and contaminants that would cause illnesses down the road.
And they only had a couple of hundred of
they-
these respiratory devices, didn't they?
The plan was there,
Yeah.
but it was never followed through. The city did not respond to its own plan.
So following December 2003, you had a number of first responders, thousands of them, coming forward and saying, look, I have a disease. This was a result of working at Ground Zero.
Yeah.
What can you do for us?
Well, unfortunately, the fund was closed, as you pointed out. And therefore, we looked to those who were responsible, who we believe were responsible for their exposure, for the failure to provide them with the proper respiratory equipment.
Right.
And that was the parties that were in control of that site, that had the ability to provide the proper equipment if they had carried through on their own plans. And that being foremost the City of New York, as well as the over 100 contractors that the city had employed to work on that site.
What was their first response when you went to them and said, you got to take care of these guys?
Well, their first response is they weren't responsible.
Because they had immunity.
That was one of their main arguments.
Because the terrorists caused this, not them.
Well, they claimed that under a rather arcane New York statute that they were immune from liability, from responsibility, because they were responding to a terrorist attack which was akin to an act of war.
This was a huge task, filing suit against the city and all the relevant parties. It took 8 years of litigation. Tell our audience what happened at the end of it.
Well, you know, to appreciate what you've just said, you know, in those 7 years of actual litigation, which was, to say the least, contentious at times, you know, there were millions of documents that had to be reviewed and sifted through to find out why this happened.
I heard there was 20 million documents, something like that?
Yes, something like, yes. I think it was more than 20 million. We took over 200 depositions of parties involved in the case. There were 3 appeals involved, where the city on 3 separate occasions attempted to have these cases dismissed for legal reasons.
Right.
It was a long journey. In my 33 years as an attorney, it was a journey that I had never experienced or expected to experience.
Yeah. Now you eventually presented, I think, was it 12 separate cases that you were going to file?
Well, there were 12 cases that had been earmarked among 10,000 cases for trial, and 3 of those 12 cases were cases that we were handling.
Right.
We handled the claims of 675 first responders.
And finally, a settlement was reached.
Yeah, after 2 years of negotiations.
$600 million plus.
It's right now, I think it stands at $650 million, and it could go as high as 700, maybe even 710 million.
Now, there has been a subsequent legislation passed, the Zadroga Act, correct?
Yes.
Where additional monies have been provided by the federal government to assist and help some of these first responders, right?
Yes, because as fair as the settlement was under the circumstances, it could not provide for full compensation. It provided for fair compensation for many of those who were injured. However, relatively speaking, you were dealing with limited funds because the city's liability is what we call capped at $1 billion. And they have to take into consideration not just the 10,000 rescue workers that brought suit, but future litigants, future workers who down the road will become ill. So this reopening the fund, known as the Zadroga Act, provides a much needed avenue for everyone to get full compensation.
Today we're going to have one of your clients, a former New York City police detective, Barbara Burnette, come on the show. She's one of the people that benefits by all of the work, the hard work that your firm did, and it's tremendous work. Before we bring her on, just tell our audience a little bit about who she is, her career, and that sort of thing.
Barbara was a police officer and detective for some 18 years with the New York City Police Department. For her, as for many of these officers and firefighters, it was not just a job, it was a career. It was something they enjoyed, something they loved, something that was an important part of their life, an important part of who they were.
Now, she was diagnosed with what type of disease?
Interstitial lung disease.
And that causes her what?
Well, it's resulted in scarring of her lungs, And at the end of the day, her ability to breathe has really been compromised to the point where it has been recommended, at least on one occasion, that she needs a lung transplant. And on top of that, she has asthma, and as well as what's known as COPD, which is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease.
Right. We are fortunate to have her with us today, so let's bring her on right now.
Sure.
It is my great pleasure to introduce Barbara Burnette to the show. Welcome to the show, Barbara.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming here today. You know, everybody who's watching this show wants to know, what was it like in those first early days when September 11th, when you, as a New York City police officer at that time, right? Were you a detective at the time?
I was.
Officer.
Detective.
Detective. Were called in here. What was your job? What were you doing?
Our job was mainly to go and rescue the people from the buildings that had collapsed.
So you were going in the buildings?
We were going to the site of the buildings.
Yes.
And we were trying to lead the people that was disoriented, you know, away from the buildings and look possibly for survivors.
Mm-hmm. What was the air like during this time?
Very thick.
Right.
You couldn't really see, but you know, you can see objects moving. You can see a lot of like body parts and a lot of debris. And
did the police department have any kind of mask for you to wear? Or?
There was no masks.
How long did you work at this site in rescuing people and helping people? How many weeks?
I think it was several weeks, at least 3 weeks.
Really? And how soon after that did you start noticing something was changing? You were having a little bit tougher time to breathe and that sort of thing?
Well, the day of, and from there on, we would get, you know, often triaged by EMS, our eyes washed out, you know, take a break to breathe and just keep moving.
Yeah. How many hours a day were you working?
I believe it was anywhere from 12 to 14 hours.
Wow. Very little sleep, huh?
Yes.
7 days a week?
7 days a week.
Wow. That is truly amazing. When did you first realize that there was something seriously wrong as a result of what happened, your exposure here at Ground Zero?
I believe it was September of '04.
Right.
I actually passed out at work. And I went to, I believe, the screening they had set up for officers.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, they realized that, like, the perfunction forming test, the PFTs, I couldn't pass them.
Right.
So they just started doing, like, a series of tests to see what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was having trouble breathing. They did a bronchoscopy and an open lung biopsy. And that's where they determined that I had something related to the World Trade Center, like lung disease.
Yeah. Now, at that time, there were other officers and people that you knew that probably had something similar. Were you aware that the Victims' Compensation Fund had already closed, the initial one?
No, I didn't know anything about the Victims' Compensation Fund.
And what was the police department, what were they saying as to how you can get some sort of medical help? Were they providing that, Nick, at that time? Through their insurance?
It wasn't so much through the police department as it was through the World Trade Center screening places that they had set up throughout the city, such as at Mount Sinai Center.
You realized soon thereafter that you really couldn't work as much as you used to and probably would have to retire, correct, as a result of this?
Yes, because I was having a series of blackouts every so often.
Right. And you eventually ended up representing how many of the first responders?
675, Steve.
675, including the firefighters?
Yes, firefighters, police officers, and other rescue and recovery workers.
When you look back at the response of the New York City, the city itself, and the 8 years that it took to set this Victims' Compensation Fund up, what is your opinion of the city and the way they responded or the lack of their response?
I don't think they took care of us as well as they should have.
Yeah.
I think they should have had something set up for us for those who got sick in the future.
Yeah. What do you think of the work that Nick's firm did on behalf of everybody?
I think they did a great job.
Yeah.
I think it was, they took care of me well.
Yeah.
They was more on a personal level, which was greatly appreciated considering the circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they did a great job, and we got a fair shake with with Nick's law firm.
Yeah. You know, I want to point out, and I pointed this out in the introduction, that your firm on the first Victims Compensation Fund did all of this work pro bono, didn't it?
That's true, Steve. We represented some 365 firefighters or families of firefighters who died on 9/11, and recovered for them through the fund some $265 million, and no fee was charged for any of those families or firefighters.
It's fabulous. I think your firm won the 2004 Pro Bono Award for that, too.
Yes, we did.
Yeah.
And I might point out, you know, because Barb will be the last one to tell you, in terms of the Victims Compensation Fund that has reopened, in that Barbara played no small part in helping bringing that about when she traveled down to Washington, as sick as she has been at times, and testified before one of the congressional committees.
What did you tell them?
That they need to take care of us, because if we had to do it all over again, we would.
Everybody that's watching this show extends their thanks, including me, for being there, because, you know, when you were called upon, you were there. It was tremendous work.
And do it again.
Okay.
And that's the answer you'll hear from all those first responders is, notwithstanding what's happened to them, what they saw happen to their brothers and their sisters, they'd do it again.
Well, you've earned my tremendous respect, and I'm sure everybody who's watching the show, both of you. And I want to thank you very much for taking the time to come here, because I know it was difficult.
Thank you.
Nick, Barbara's a tremendous client. You have helped so many people in this city, and to do so in the beginning without being paid, that must have been a big strain on your firm.
It was, but it was the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we've known these firefighters for decades. We know what they go through. You know, where people are trying to escape harm's way, they're going right into it.
Yeah.
And they deserve that type of representation for what happened on 9/11.
Well, tremendous work. Thank you very much for being on the program, and keep up this great spirit.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks for joining us. You can get more information about our guest and the issues at insiderexclusive.com.